Hi there, welcome to Chapter 10, and we're going to complement what we looked at last time with a focus on not so much learning, but sort of the preparations necessary for crisis planning. We're going to talk about a concept we call risk. One of the things I don't do in this class, and I can't do everything I'd like to do in a class, is to really spend time developing or promoting the idea of creating emergency or crisis plans. There are a lot of models out there you can follow, and it's not hard for you to think about planning a crisis for your particular job site or location or industry. And I really invite you that if you're interested in this material and you want to take it into the workplace and or your home, that you investigate good planning models for a crisis when they arise and think about developing those. But it's something I don't spend really time in this class necessarily talking about, even though it could be easily a subject we could take a week on or more. But we are going to talk about something slightly related to that, maybe somewhat more abstract, and that is the study of risk communication. Originally, when the field of communication started really exploring crisis, we focused almost entirely on the aftermath. What happens when a crisis occurs and how should we respond afterwards? We've evolved and grown this area of interest to include the study of risk communication, to think about not only what happens afterwards, but what has happened before a crisis. What have we been doing that might help mitigate or reduce or prevent future crises? And how can an understanding of risk help us to prep an organization for that potential crisis that could occur, and also help prevent audiences from being too totally unaware or unprepared for a crisis? So the risk communication has become a real complementary area of study, and so I wanted to add that and put that into your thinking. So this week is all about getting an organization to think strategically about how crises either before or afterwards are going to affect them. Your textbook defines risk communication as an interactive process of exchange of information and opinion among individuals, groups, and institutions. That doesn't say a whole lot other than the fact, and one of the important facts is that this is a process that you need to do with as many people as possible. You need to start thinking about brainstorming and imagining what could happen to your organization. Usually no crisis has occurred yet, so risk communication is looking at areas of uncertainty, areas of potential danger or threat, and getting you as an organization to prepare oneself for that possibility. And so thinking ahead and thinking of what can go wrong is an important consideration. There's a little chart at the bottom of page 161 in your textbook that you can also use that helps to kind of distinguish the idea of risk versus crisis communication from each other. Risk tends to be more future-oriented. It is more abstract, perhaps. It's not about a specific singular issue or example. But look at those differences. One of the ways this chapter kind of connects to the earlier one on organizational learning is imagine how, if you've had a crisis or even a small incident, how good risk communication practice can lead to better preparation for future crisis, how you would incorporate this idea of organizational learning into risk assessment to prepare your organization for the future. So there's a connection and tie-in between these two chapters. In some respects, maybe they're backwards, but certainly in the sequence of events that occurs for organizations where multiple crises occur, organizational learning should also incorporate risk communication practices so they're prepared for the next one, so the next time they respond more effectively. So think about how those elements combine and how they relate to each other, and how we can reduce a crisis through good risk thinking and risk preparations. So let's look quickly at the opportunities again that risk provides. One thing you can do is obviously prevent a crisis from occurring and disrupt it. So if your social media team, for example, is monitoring the social media platforms and discover there's a lot of disappointment or anger by customers or people developed towards your product, maybe you can prevent that crisis from getting bigger. Maybe you can change it. Maybe you can fix it. Maybe you can address it. Understanding where a crisis could be happening is an important part of the process. So risk identification means thinking about there is a risk that evolves, learning about it, making a priority, deciding, obviously, for example, you can't fix every single complaint, and you can't treat every complaint about your product or service or your restaurant or your food or anything else as a full-blown crisis, but you need to prioritize those that might lead to larger, longer, more significant harm to your organization. And ask yourself, then, can you change the behavior? Can you manufacture things differently? Can you act differently? Can you, be more visible on social media? What do you need to do? So if you can cut short a crisis, there are more than a few crises that have happened. Domino's had this happen with a food contamination issue, and Kryptonite Lock had this happen when people discovered they could pick their locks very easily and they didn't respond very quickly. You need to prioritize and determine whether or not some level of complaint or incident is going to lead to a bigger crisis. If you can prevent it from happening, shut it down, great. That's what risk thinking is all about. Opportunity 2 is a mindful outlook. You had that model of mindfulness from Vail in an earlier reading. Some of that is in here as well, but think about how we can think and prepare ourselves for a possible crisis. That doesn't mean we live in fear. It doesn't mean we live assuming that things are always going to go wrong. But we do think about it in a way that's healthy and productive. So mindfulness will help prevent the crisis because, yes, we are preoccupied for failure in the sense that we know it's possible. So we keep an eye out for possible threats to our organization. We don't oversimplify. We don't make too many assumptions. We don't allow ourselves to forget about. If you look at some of these crises you've studied, they're pretty intricate. A number of variables come together. And it's not a simple matter to solve them or deal with them. You want to be sensitive to operations and people, show a great deal of compassion and caring. Resilience is a term that's being used a lot now in the literature. We talk about the capacity to bounce back from a crisis. So how can you prepare your infrastructure, your people, your community to take a crisis in stride and move forward? And what can you do to help protect people so they feel, that they can go on, that they can succeed or even thrive after a particular crisis happens? This is also your opportunity to find some expertise and recognize the fact that there are a number of people, consultants and others, who could really help advise you on good crisis management, and you should be taking that advice. And so if you haven't incorporated the advice of pros, you should. I mentioned in the last video, I think, this idea of a high reliability organization. Poultry plants that process meat, aircraft carriers, nuclear power plants, any place where a possible contamination or threat or explosion or danger exists. These places are often very safe from the perspective of accidents because they have created an environment, a culture of caution. And as a result, they are very good at preventing possible crises. So this mindfulness concept is a really good one for you to keep in mind. I think a lot of parents with kids already have that concept down pat. They're always thinking about what's going to go wrong, and they try to anticipate it so their kids don't create greater problems. We just need corporations to incorporate that same idea. Possibly beyond that as well, we have a few other opportunities. There's the work of Sandman, who talks about risk and outrage. Remember when we talked earlier about this idea of perception and about uncertainty? People need to think about dangers that are real and those that they perceive. So, for example, every time a plane crashes, people are afraid of flying planes, even though statistically they're pretty darn safe. It's not that the hazard itself is that difficult or real, it's people's perception of it. So what we always have to keep in mind is not only what has happened to an organization, but how people process and think about it. So even though maybe financially and statistically and your company runs into some issue or problem and you think, oh, we'll be fine, we'll take a day off, we'll move forward later, and we can fix things and everything's okay. That doesn't meet necessarily the demands of people's outrage or fear. So the risk opportunity 3 is really thinking about how do people's perceptions play into things. Now, if you can prepare people so their perception of your organization is positive and less threatening and less in danger, so if a crisis happens to you, they're not going to jump to the greatest extreme. And so thinking about risk, hazard, and outrage together is one way to think about the opportunity that this planning has for your organization. Finally, there's a good ethical component to this chapter. Your authors provide what they call a concept called significant choice. And it's an ethical perspective that basically means that audiences have a right and they have the need to know about the possible risks associated with things so they can make choices for themselves. And feel free in making choices that are not being manipulated or misleading, and that they've got an honest access to information to make a decision that could in fact in part endanger them. And so if you look at the standards and avoid the kind of misinformation, basically the idea here is you don't make promises you can't keep. You don't downplay a crisis to a point of non-existence when you know that it could happen, even if there's a small chance of it. People have the right of being able to make decisions. And even if they make a difficult or a choice that is dangerous, the fact is they've had that opportunity to make that choice. For example, a decision to smoke or drink and drive or use, let's say, marijuana. There are pros and cons. There are dangers. There are threats. And, part of the idea is that people need to know of those threats. We don't hide them. We don't deny them. We don't avoid them. We confront them. If they still decide to make a decision that is dangerous, they've made that decision. We've had labels on cigarettes for decades now. Okay, we've told them about the possible risk. They know that. They can make the decision about whether they should smoke or not, and ideally do so with those same threats in mind. And so the idea of significant choice is to give people, not to force people to make decisions or not to do things, but give them the data and information they need so they can make a decision effectively for their own purposes and safety. So this idea of a fantasy message that is just totally outside of reality, sure, it may reassure them, but it's really going to come crashing down when a problem occurs. So be realistic. Be upfront with information. This idea of transparency has become a real important concept. Tell people what the risks are. Let them make a decision. And some will make it in favor and some will not, but at least they've made it confident, knowing that they understand the possible risks. Discussion questions for this week are looking at things like how can we learn from a crisis. Use some examples in this set of discussion questions, right? Think about your workplace. Think about, organizations in this community. What could they do to learn? And how do we learn? How do we implement the learning we have? We talked a little bit about that. But use an example and show me just how an organization can incorporate learning and risk as part of their planning. And think about also then how we would talk to audiences about possible risks versus a crisis. Since a risk is about a crisis that doesn't happen, this is an opportunity oftentimes to address people that are probably a little more rational, but nevertheless need this information in order to make decisions someday. So we have our discussion questions in place. I believe this week you also have an exam coming up at the end of the week. Be prepared for that as well. Contact me if you have any questions. And thank you, and we'll talk soon. Goodbye.